Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Facebook Live on sustainable infrastructure. My name's John Ferreter. I'm from the Office of External Relations here at the Inter-American Development Bank. This afternoon, I'm joined by two experts on the topic. Amalie Amin, who is the Chief of the Climate Change Division here at the bank, and Graham Watkins, Principal Specialist in that same division. Let's get started. Remember to send us your questions via the comments section on your screen. Let's start with Amalie. First of all, why is sustainable infrastructure important for the Latin American and Caribbean region? And why is the IDB focused on this? Of all of the myriad of sectors that we need to deal with on the development agenda, why sustainable infrastructure?
Well, thank you, John, and hello, everyone. So infrastructure really is core to growth and development. We know that. In 2015, the world community recognized that sustainable infrastructure is effectively needed to deliver on the Sustainable Development Growth Agenda. So the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed in 2015 really embody very much a focus on what needs to be achieved in regards to infrastructure and the importance of that being sustainable. But then, perhaps more importantly, in many respects, the Paris Agreement that was agreed also in 2015 recognized that emissions and growth of emissions from infrastructure, particularly in developing countries, really need to come down very rapidly. So the focus on infrastructure and the infrastructure decisions that are being made now have to be consistent with the Paris Agreement, hence the importance of infrastructure being low carbon. At the same time, there are already many climate impacts embodied into the system, the climate system. So we also have to ensure that increasingly infrastructure is made more resilient to those impacts moving forward. So those and many of the solutions that really help to make infrastructure more resilient also lie in the sort of natural capital, use of natural resources. So really re-emphasizing the importance of sustainable infrastructure for our region. And we as a development bank, a lot of what we do is around infrastructure, and of course we are key partners to our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, around implementing their commitments to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals agenda and of course their commitments under the Paris Agreement. And so a focus on sustainable infrastructure really is an essential part of that, and that really involves engaging with governments around the agenda, but also increasingly recognizing the importance of mobilizing private sector investment. The scale of the investment challenge is huge. We anticipate or we expect that around 5% of GDP of the region is needed to go into sustainable infrastructure. Regardless of whether that is sustainable or not, the scale of investment is large, but to ensure that it is sustainable, there are some fairly small scale additional costs with regards to the total amount. But even so, the scale of the investment very much exceeds the ability of governments to deliver that through their own public balance sheets, through off their own public expenditure. So it becomes really critical to mobilize the private sector, and that's also a big part of what we are focused on here at the IDB Group.
Good. So the big picture, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, we've got the Addis Ababa Agenda, we've got the Paris Agreement. Graham, let me turn to you. What about the definitional question? Is there a standard definition of sustainable infrastructure? Why do we need one? What's the IDB's thought about defining parameters and coming up with a framework?
Well, thanks for this opportunity to be here as well, and welcome to everybody on Facebook. I think it might be worthwhile starting off as to say exactly why you actually need a definition, and I think Amalie's already begun to do that by basically pointing out that you're trying to change a system, and you have to be very clear when you're trying to change a system as to what you're trying to change it to at one level. So that's part of the reason for defining it. But the other is that we also want to bring more players on board with us. And if you're not clear about what you're trying to achieve, then it's going to be very hard to bring those players on board. And that's particularly true when you're trying to mobilize substantial amounts of finance from new kinds of investors. So part of the trick here is to basically be able to explain to them exactly what we're trying to achieve through this process. The other, one of the challenges is really bringing in more finance to infrastructure in general, but the other is to change the nature of that infrastructure, to change it from a sort of a business as usual infrastructure. And I'm not saying it's going to be like a quantum leap. It's more like gradual evolution. You're going to move slowly towards more and more sustainable infrastructure. You're not going to be able to change it from one day to the other, but having a clear objective at the end of the day as to what sustainable infrastructure is absolutely critical in that sense. I also think it's important that we be very careful of not putting old wine into new bottles. So basically saying this is sustainable infrastructure when it's actually not sustainable infrastructure. And this has been raised with things like green bonds in the past, and it's always an issue. It's often discussed as being greenwashing, as it were. Yeah. So I think that needs to be we need very carefully to do that. And the mechanism for doing this is really to start with the way in which banks and other groups have actually begun to put in place regulatory systems that can control the damaging effects of infrastructure, so the do no harm approach. And that obviously is the basis for this. The second level of this is to actually look at how you can better prepare projects, how you can put more effort into the preparation side of projects to make sure that they incorporate some of these sustainability issues, particularly things like resilience and dealing with stakeholders effectively. And the third area, which is often kind of forgotten about, is that you really need to make this work. You have to do this systemically at the level of policy and institutions. You really have to change the way those work to be able to support those project level activities. And the fourth level of this is you really have to change the financial system. So coming back to the original question, and sorry for being so long about that, as to what is sustainable infrastructure, you could start with what's sustainable infrastructure by sort of leading off from Brundtland, if you want to, and thinking about sustainability or sustainable development as being basically allowing people in the future to at least have the same opportunity to meet their needs as we have today, in essence, making sure that that happens. And that is a base starting point. That's particularly critical for infrastructure, because if you build a piece of infrastructure, it's going to last you up to 40 years, maybe sometimes even longer. I mean, Roman infrastructure is still around Europe, so that's been around a very long time, though it's not used that much. Well, some of it's still used, but still. So you have to really think that this is an intergenerational process. What you do today is going to affect the next generation. It's not just going to affect your generation, it's going to affect what happens to people. The other thing about the infrastructure is that it actually has lots of externalities. Those can be positive, those can be negative externalities, and they're very difficult to capture in the context of a single project. It's hard to actually understand what they're going to be. So it's absolutely critical to get that thinking right at the beginning. And very quickly, what would that mean? That means kind of looking at a project and making sure that it's economically and financially sustainable right at the beginning. That means that you really need to look at those externalities to the extent that you can. Some of them are very difficult to capture, but make sure that those are incorporated into the planning process. Take a look at, make sure that whatever infrastructure you build has positive economic and social returns over that long term. And really, part of this is also comes back to this question of, Amelie was mentioned, how do you get the private sector engaged in this, is to make sure that you can basically manage the risk issues associated with the infrastructure projects, because they are complex and they have different phases, and that makes it quite difficult. I think that's probably one of the harder areas of sustainability to deal with. The other two, well, there's three more I'm going to talk about, but two are relatively simpler. The environmental sustainability, which is basically that you protect natural environments, that you use resources as efficiently and sustainably as you possibly can, you curb pollution, and you particularly, given today's issues, you manage greenhouse gas emissions, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's obviously going to be a lot of discussion on exactly what that means, but that has to be part of a sustainable infrastructure project. And you also need to address the coming, or today they're actually here, climate impacts as well. So you need to address resilience and those kinds of things, and natural disasters. It also needs to be socially sustainable. You need to look at how you engage with communities. Many projects are derailed because they don't engage effectively with communities, so they're stopped. So you never deliver the infrastructure at the end of the day, so that's critical. You need to manage social impacts. You need to look at human and worker rights. You need to look at cultural preservation. And finally, and perhaps one of the, again, often forgotten but very important, is the institutional sustainability. And that means making sure that what you do is aligned to things like the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, to these global agendas, that you address governance issues and management system issues within the operation and within the companies or groups that are actually building the infrastructure. So you can have internal accountability on sustainability issues, and you have to build capacities. Because if we don't build capacities, you're not going to be able to do any of this stuff.
Perfect segue. Erika Vega from Guatemala asks particularly about the social dimension. What about investing in infrastructure that's sustainable in social and particularly gender terms?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, that is essential. It's core to what we talk about when we mean sustainable infrastructure. As Graham set out, it's not, sustainable does not refer to environmental only, but it is that. It doesn't refer to being financially sustainable, although that is also really important, but rather the social, including gender equality, gender issues, is also key. Because if there isn't that social buy-in, that social contract, as often it's referred to, if that doesn't exist, then that infrastructure may not be seen as beneficial to the community. It won't necessarily lead to inclusive growth, which is a key part of countries' sustainable development goals and sustainable development agendas. And so having that sustainability from a social point of view is really important. And that's something we at the IDB Group place a huge amount of attention on. And we have also very strong focus on gender and how we can best integrate and mainstream gender into everything we do, and in particular in infrastructure. And we have some good examples of how that's been working in the transportation sector, actually accessing climate resources to also help bring in gender where that's possible, because that aspect of the social contract, if you like, but also ensuring that women are actively part of contributing but also benefiting from that infrastructure is really essential.
And actually we're about to publish a paper that looks at 200 projects in Latin America, infrastructure projects, that were selected because they will have conflict in them. Mm-hmm. So the paper actually analyzes what are the causes of those conflicts, what's led to those conflicts, and then also what are the consequences of those conflicts, and what does the end result mean. It doesn't go into the level of detail about how much costs have gone up as a result of that, but it starts moving in that direction. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And 200 projects wasn't hard to find in Latin America, to be completely honest. Conflict is a major part of infrastructure in general. And this issue of social license, actually, to do infrastructure has been well treated if you look at the extractive industries. And they've spent a lot of effort trying to work out exactly how you can better manage social issues around their projects. And I think there needs to be a very similar element of that going into the work that we're doing with sustainable infrastructure. It's obviously a very key component of the sustainability analysis. At the moment, we have about 61 indicators or 61 criteria that we're looking at with respect to how you might define sustainability.
A checklist?
It's a checklist, but we want to make it a little bit broader than a checklist, so it's explanatory in some sense. But I also want to point out that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here, because a lot of these things have already been looked at. If you look at the IFC performance standards, if you look at our own safeguard standards, those cover one side of it, but there are also a lot of tools out there, Envision, IS Rating, SURE, CEQAL, which look at sustainability assessment in the project preparation and design phase. And INVEST is another one that looks just at transport. But those are tools to basically start asking these questions so that you get a better design projects. Mm-hmm. And if those things are done seamlessly together at a project level, you can start looking at solving sustainability issues. That still doesn't solve your problem at the policy and institutional and planning levels.
So exactly, I think, so we're looking at a framework that can bring together lots of different standards, lots of different tools, of which there are thousands. I mean, the building sector, there are over 1,000 different standards. We've heard of LEED, there's EDGE, there's many out there. So I'm not trying to suggest there needs to be one standard, but there needs to be more of an organising framework, if you like. I mean, this was very much one of the key issues that emerged from our partnership with Mercer, who advise pension funds, asset managers, that if we're trying to attract investors, mobilize investors into this infrastructure, then they really want to understand, actually, well, what is this? How do we assess whether this truly is sustainable or not? and seeing that with so many different standards and tools and methodologies out there, how to create what we've been trying to do and thinking about is how to create a framework by which we can help to make it, bring some of the complexity into a more coherent approach that can be beneficial to attract investors.
Good. I'm glad that you're catching on and sending us some questions. I wanted to ask about the challenges to increasing investment in sustainable infrastructure. And apropos of that, Gigi Hart from the Bahamas asks, why do you think certain countries are averse to infrastructure innovation, which they wrongly believe will reduce jobs? That this is some sort of zero or negative sum. Solar energy, coastal erosion mitigation, et cetera, come to mind. So in the context of challenges, investors' mindsets, perhaps, any reaction?
Investor mindsets, or I think also, how do governments approach this? Yeah. And I think, as with any new innovation, any new technology, a lack of familiarity can raise concerns. It can create perceptions that it's not going to deliver what it says. It won't actually perform. That is seen from an investor point of view as a risk that can prevent them from investing. From a government point of view, well, why go for something new if actually you think your more familiar concept or approach may deliver? And that's, I think, one of the key challenges that we face in delivering on sustainable infrastructure, in that recognizing that it can be done, and by bringing in many aspects, such as we've talked about quite a lot, the social aspects, which includes engaging with not just those who may be benefiting from the infrastructure, but those who will be engaged in construction and operation and maintenance. There needs to be a focus on ensuring that the skill set also exists. And so it won't lead to stranded jobs or potential loss of jobs, but rather can actually create new jobs. And we've actually done quite a bit of work on this here at the bank, looking at how, as countries develop their climate agendas and look forward to a 2050 pathway, how to ensure that their climate actions and the path they take, rather than potentially leads to stranded assets, can also lead to new jobs. And that's going to be really, really important. So I think Gigi's question is really quite spot on, actually, because that is one of the big issues governments in particular are facing, how to minimize stranded assets, stranded jobs, and maximize opportunities and new jobs, new growth opportunities that can come with sustainable infrastructure.
Good. And I would just say that actually innovation is one of those criteria that we've incorporated into our framework, and it is critical for sustainability. I think you do need to both be able to introduce innovation, but then also deliver the innovation. The other side of this is that one of the things that we're constantly looking for are examples of new innovative ways of actually addressing this issue, so that we can then use that for teaching and learning, or convincing as a sort of a part of the business case for other groups. So it's absolutely critical in terms of the education process.
Good. Question from Ron Jube, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Suriname. To either of you, is 5% of the national budget a prerequisite for sustainable development or a starting point, a start? How is the IDB helping guide governments to make the right investments? And in fact, maybe taking off on that, what kinds of work is the IDB group actually doing to support the countries in terms of sustainable infrastructure, both on the public sector side and on the private sector side? But the 5% threshold.
Yeah. So, well, the estimation is that, broadly speaking, the region needs to spend around 5% of GDP on infrastructure. That said, what does it translate into a national budget perspective? Well, the key then becomes how much can the private sector be mobilized? So how much public money needs to go in versus how that public resource is utilized to best mobilize the private sector. So a lot of what we are doing with governments and also with the private sector is to find ways of really ensuring that public resources can be used most effectively for greatest impact for sustainable infrastructure. And that takes a range of activities. And this gets back to the idea of having a focus on some of the upstream, the policy, the enabling conditions, ensuring the institutional framework is most enabling, if you like, for the private sector. And that ranges from looking at different regulations that exist, how public-private partnerships are designed, what are procurement rules, etc., and how those are creating greater certainty to the private sector that they will have a return on their investment. And by creating that, those enabling conditions, that can be more attractive to private sector resources coming in. That said, when we look from the upstream down to the design and the construction of projects, how best can the private sector come in at that stage? There is a lot of discussion around risk at the construction phase, how best to minimize that, and there are different ways that that can be achieved. And in fact, what we heard from investors, that having multilateral development banks involved can actually help reduce some of their concerns, because they know that we have a good track record in that country. We know the players, we know the government, we have very good due diligence processes around this, and so that can also help reduce their risk at the construction phase. We may not directly take on risk, but that can actually reduce risk. And then there's the takeout, if you like. What's the once the infrastructure is up and running, once it's actually operational, how can that, is there a role then to help those assets be moved into the capital markets, right. Hence the institutional investors, a lot of the discussion we had in the context of our Mercer report. And there we see the role of using financial instruments in an innovative way and accessing concessional resource from, say, the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, that can help us take on some of the risk to bring in those investors. And so, you know, we're seeing this in a number of ways, and most of what we do to Ron, in response to your question, is exactly that, helping our governments and working with different stakeholders, including the private sector, to help them make the right decisions around investments that will secure not just their needs in the near future, but also in the longer term.
Good. Question from Marta Torres in Peru. And it goes to the safeguards, I think. How does the IDB help governments meet social and environmental safeguards? And I suppose this could be at a programmatic level in addition to at a project-specific level. Does the bank work on national legal frameworks with governments in order to promote sustainable infrastructure in Latin America? Graham, I might pass that hot potato to you.
Not so much of a hot potato, and I've actually worked directly in Peru looking at things like building the national system for offsets, for example, where we work directly with the Ministry of Environment to look at that. But to cut a long story short, one of the areas in which our safeguards group is actually working is in what's called country systems. A part of country systems is really looking at how you can help to build capacities within countries, regulatory capacities within countries that meet the standards of the banks to some extent. Now, if you were to take that as a whole, that would be a practically impossible job to be able to do, and it would cost a lot of money to be able to do that across the whole of Latin America. So one of the areas that we've started working in, at least the safeguard, I used to work in safeguards, so this is why I can answer the question, is that we've actually started to create policy dialogues directly with those groups that are responsible for the regulatory systems within the countries to look at what their issues are and look at ways in which we can actually support them with capacity
from civil society.
This is more directly with the regulatory groups in the government. And as part of that process, we've actually done a couple of online courses as a bank. We've done one that's on general environmental impact assessment processes. When I was in Safeguards, we also worked on one that's specifically on the biodiversity impacts, which is very much focused on infrastructure, because infrastructure is the main driver of biodiversity impacts in that context. And then now, I believe, about to launch one on social issues as well. So that's mainly the way we've been doing that kind of work.
We'll try and provide some information on the MOOCs and the other products and things that we've offered. I'm conscious of the time getting scarce here. Let me get to Graham. Now, I'll start with you, but Amali, please chip in as you wish. How does the region stand in terms of investment? Maybe a couple of examples of noteworthy projects or lines of action to look for, but Latin America as opposed to perhaps other emerging regions.
I think we've already touched on the issue of what the kinds of investments should be that,
Yeah.
and in fact, one of the interesting things about Latin America is if you go back to the 1980s, the actual public investment in infrastructure has dropped off since the 1980s. And so there are various estimates around there. There's actually a very good recent paper by the World Bank, which takes a lot of our data actually, but which looks at the infrastructure needs in Latin America that came out a couple of months ago by Marian Finn. And that details out a lot of these issues with respect to what's actually going on in the region by sector, in essence. But quickly going through the sectors, I mean, you could say that if you look at the energy sector, for example, right now I think we have about 96% access to electricity in Latin America, which is very, very high compared to other places. And 56% of that's renewable energy, which is also exceedingly high. So that's the good news. On the other side, hydropower is the main source of that renewable energy within Latin America. And we already know and have seen in several countries across Latin America that climate change will impact on your ability to generate from hydropower. And this is one of the issues that we're actually doing a study on now, both in Central America and in South America, looking at exactly what that means, what are the implications of that. And that actually would be tied back into our own internal systems of how do we actually recognize those kinds of risks and better manage those kinds of risks in our projects directly. We've also talked a little bit about the issues of conflict. Hydropower is also, but let's not go into that in a great deal of detail. Interestingly about climate change, though, there's also an analysis done by a group called Acclimatized for the World Bank that basically pointed out that if you look at PPP frameworks, they don't actually address that issue. They don't actually ask, when you're creating PPPs, the companies to actually address the issue of climate risk, which is rather shocking given that we're actually seeing these impacts. And it's not just obviously in hydropower, it's across the board in infrastructure. If you look at Peru, look at other places more recently. So,
can I just on that though, because I mean you asked about the region and how the region stands. Actually, the region does have some, I would say, leading examples of how it is addressing many of these issues. So Colombia, for example, in their PPP framework for roads, actually, construction of roads, they actually explicitly have a measure around a risk associated with climate impacts and provide some resource to help cover flooding if that help means that road then can't be utilised because of flooding, for example. And that's actually a really interesting leading example of how climate risk is being addressed. Colombia also has some other areas that it's started to look at from a climate risk perspective. And we can find good examples across the region. But I think the real challenge is how to really take those good examples, how to replicate those, and how to bring those to scale. That can be, well, particularly scale of investment, but also to ensure that it becomes really business as usual, so that all infrastructure takes on board climate risk, all infrastructure is seen through a sustainability lens, both environmental, social, economic and financial, and institutional. And I think that's where the region is. There is a lot of leadership. We're working with countries through our NDC Invest platform to help translate NDCs, countries nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, to translate those into investment plans that can deliver sustainable infrastructure. And we see many countries in the region, taking a real leadership role in that respect. And that really emphasizes some of the benefits that those governments in emphasizing and strengthening the institutional arrangements around their NDCs will really help to better deliver sustainable infrastructure. But we need to move faster. We know the challenge is huge, and we also know we don't have a huge amount of time, given that climate change is happening already. So it's good. There's a lot of good practice in the region, but we need to really take that good practice, scale up, and do more.
Last word, and it was spot on while you were speaking. Pablo Fernandez from Chile. Even as you both were mentioning PPPs, public-private partnerships, APPs, I guess in Spanish, what role can they play, do they play in fostering sustainable infrastructure? I think you've covered it largely, but maybe a final word on that.
I mean, they're essential now. As governments are facing fiscal constraints throughout the world, in Latin America and the Caribbean for sure, the ability to mobilize private sector becomes critical. So designing good PPPs, public-private partnerships, that ensures best mobilization of private sector resources, also private sector expertise into sustainable infrastructure. That's really the challenge for governments, to use their own public resources, whether that's through policy and regulatory frameworks, whether it's through public resources to help project preparation, or whether it's through financial resources maybe further down the line.
Terrific. I think sadly we need to leave it there. We could go on. I'd love to go on, but let me stop there. I hope that you all enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for your appropriate, pertinent questions. Don't forget to download the publication from the comments section. There's a link in on the IDB Facebook page to the Mercer publication done jointly with the IDB, Crossing the Bridge to Sustainable Infrastructure Investing. Also follow our blog, Let's Talk About Climate Change. And once again, thanks very much to all of you for participating with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to Amalie and Graham.